Growing up, I was always the quiet one in the family. My name is Olivia, and I'm 32 now, but even as a child, I remember being treated more like a shadow than a daughter. My father, a stern man who believed in earning your place, always reminded me that I was a burden. My mother, while gentler, did nothing to stop him. I was the youngest of 3 siblings, but somehow, I was the only one expected to shrink myself to make room for everyone else. When my older brothers got into trouble, I was the one sent to clean up their mess. When they needed money, I was told to pitch in, despite barely affording my own groceries. But before I go on, let me ask you something. If your own family humiliated you in your own house, would you still let them stay rent-free? Tell me what you'd do in the comments, because I'm about to show you what I did. And hey, if you're hooked already, don't forget to like this story and subscribe for more jaw-dropping twists. The house we lived in, the house they claimed, was a stunning old craftsman in the suburbs passed down from my grandfather. For as long as I could remember, they called it our legacy, and I used to believe it too. I even paid for renovations when the roof started leaking, and the kitchen needed remodeling. I took out loans under my name to save that house, believing I was preserving something sacred, but they never acknowledged my contributions. Not once. It wasn't until my father's 65th birthday that the final crack appeared. My family threw a big party at the house, our house, I thought, and invited all the extended relatives and friends. I wasn't even asked to help plan. I showed up on time, gift in hand, and greeted the guests with a smile. But when my father stood to give a speech, thanking everyone who had supported him, he listed off name after name. My mother, my brothers, even a distant cousin who loaned him $500 once. My name, not a whisper, when I approached him afterward and jokingly said, "You forgot me in your thank yous." He looked me in the eye and said coldly, "What exactly have you done for this family?" I was stunned. "I helped pay for the roof." He cut me off. "You live here rent-free. You're just a burden." That sentence didn't just sting. It shattered something in me. I didn't say anything else that evening. I left early, taking my uneaten cake in a napkin like some outsider. I went to my room upstairs and stared at the ceiling. Just a burden. After everything I had given, that's all I was. I didn't cry that night. Instead, I did something more dangerous. I got curious. I pulled out the old paperwork I had kept after helping with the renovation loan. And then I remembered something odd. When Grandpa passed, there was a lot of drama about the will. But I was the only one who had sat through that lawyer's meeting. My father had been too busy, and my brothers didn't care. I rummaged through my files and after an hour of digging, found a document stamped with my name. My hands trembled. The deed to the house was in my name. My grandfather had left the house to me. I blinked at the paper as if it would change. No wonder my father never talked about it. He probably assumed it had reverted to him. Or maybe he thought I would never realize. But here it was, legal and clear. I owned the house, the place they had always used to belittle me, to exclude me, to remind me of my place. Suddenly, I didn't feel small anymore. I started to think differently after that night. Every cruel word, every time they told me I didn't belong, none of it held weight now. The very roof over their heads. It was mine and they didn't know it, not yet. I didn't sleep that night. I planned. The next morning the house felt different. Maybe it was me who had changed, not the house. The walls I once admired, the ornate crown molding, the creaky hardwood floors that told stories with every step, all of it suddenly felt like mine in a way it never had before. Not emotionally, not metaphorically, but legally. That deed, still sitting on my desk, had rewritten the entire history of my relationship with this place, and more importantly, with my family. They just didn't know it yet. At breakfast, my father made his usual grumbles about the coffee not being strong enough and the eggs being overdone. My mother sat quietly sipping her tea while my brothers, both of whom had returned temporarily between jobs, sat like kings at the table. No one looked at me. No one ever did unless they needed something. So Olivia, my eldest brother, Scott, began with an overly sweet tone, "Any chance you could help me out with rent again this month?" It was so casual, as if I were the family piggy bank. I smiled, but not kindly. You're still staying here rent-free. That's enough help, don't you think? He blinked, stunned for a moment, then scoffed. You've been staying here free for years. And just like that, the myth of my freeloading self was paraded again. Before I could respond, my father set down his fork with a clatter. Don't start with your attitude, Olivia. No one wants to hear your drama this early in the day. There it was again, that immediate dismissal. Like my thoughts, my presence. My voice was an inconvenience, a waste of space, but this time I didn't flinch. I didn't lower my gaze or retreat. Instead, I picked up my plate, rinsed it, and walked calmly out of the kitchen. I didn't slam the door. I didn't give them the satisfaction of seeing me rattle. Instead, I went upstairs, made a few calls, and started the wheels in motion. First, I called the lawyer who'd handled my grandfather's estate. He was retired now but remembered the case. Yes, Olivia, he said, his voice gruff with age but clear. The house was left solely to you. I remember the arguments that followed, but the will was airtight. No contest was ever filed. I asked him to send me an official copy with the court seal, just to be safe. Next, I called a real estate attorney, not to sell the house, not yet, but to ask about my rights as the sole owner regarding occupants who had been living in the home under false assumptions. He explained my options. Legal eviction was possible, but it would be messy, emotional. He advised I try mediation first. I thanked him and ended the call. By dinner, I had everything I needed, and yet I said nothing. I sat at the table while they bickered about TV remotes and who was using the most hot water. No one noticed I was unusually quiet. No one noticed anything about me at all. The next day, I went to a local bank and opened a new safety deposit box. I placed a copy of the deed inside it, along with a typed note that simply said, "You never asked what I owned. You only ever told me what I owed." That weekend, we hosted another family gathering. My father insisted I stay upstairs during it to avoid making things awkward. I nearly laughed aloud. Instead, I dressed in a soft burgundy dress and came downstairs anyway, greeting guests like a proper host. After all, it was my house. A few relatives were surprised to see me, and one even whispered, "I thought Olivia had moved out years ago." I smiled and said nothing. That evening, as everyone sipped drinks in the garden, I brought out a simple envelope and placed it on the coffee table in the living room. The deed. It was sitting right there, visible, unassuming, but a landmine. "Whose mail is that?" my mother asked. "Mine," I said without looking up from my glass. My father glanced at it, but didn't even bother to ask. The moment passed. I didn't push it. I wanted them to find it in their own time. And they did, 2 days later. I was in my room when I heard the slam of a door downstairs, followed by heavy footsteps coming up. My father barged in without knocking, waving the deed in his hand. "Is this some kind of joke?" "No," I said calmly. "That's the legal deed to this property. It's been in my name since Grandpa passed. I found it while cleaning out my files. Thought it was about time you all saw it. You're telling me this house belongs to you." His voice was laced with disbelief and rage. "That's exactly what I'm telling you." He stared at me, lips twitching with words he wasn't ready to say. Eventually he turned and stormed out. My mother didn't speak to me for a day and a half. My brothers. They tried to act like it didn't matter, like this didn't change anything, but I could feel it in the air. I had upset the ecosystem, the one where I was supposed to be small, dependent, and quiet. The shift was uncomfortable for all of us. But for me, it was long overdue. By the end of that week, my lawyer had sent formal notices to each occupant of the house, my parents and both brothers. Not eviction notices, just letters explaining the new terms of residence. If they wished to continue living in my home, they would need to sign rental agreements and begin paying modest rent. Nothing exploitative, just fair. My father tore the letter in half in front of me. My brothers refused to acknowledge it at all. My mother wept. They claimed I was ungrateful, manipulative, cruel, but all I did was give them what they had always asked from me: independence, accountability. For the first time, I wasn't asking to belong. I was setting the rules, and this was just the beginning. The morning after the rental agreement letters were sent out, the house was eerily quiet. No clinking of dishes, no chatter from my brothers as they debated whose turn it was to do something they never actually did. Just silence, but not peace, the kind of silence that simmers, slow, heavy, and filled with unspoken anger. It clung to the walls like smoke. I sat in the living room, sipping tea, when my mother walked in. She didn't sit. She just stood there, hands folded tight, her lips twitching with some internal war. "You humiliated your father," she said finally, not looking at me. I sent rental terms, not eviction letters. I replied evenly, "You know how this makes us look, to the rest of the family, your cousins, your aunts and uncles. They're talking about this already. Good." I said, "Let them talk. Maybe they'll finally see I'm not invisible." Her face twisted in disbelief. "You think this is about visibility, Olivia? This is about loyalty, family, loyalty?" I almost laughed. "Is that what you call years of being treated like a maid in my own home?" Her silence was more telling than any apology, and then she left, quietly, still without ever acknowledging the truth, that everything they had built their status on, their control on, stood on ground they never owned. Later that afternoon, I got a call from my lawyer. "There's been some pushback," he said, almost amused. "Your father called, tried to claim the deed was faked. I told him you have the original and it's recorded with the county." I thanked him and hung up. But I wasn't surprised. My father had never been one to accept a loss, especially not one where he'd have to admit he'd been wrong about me. That evening, I found an envelope slipped under my bedroom door. No name, no handwriting, just a folded piece of paper. I opened it slowly. "If you do this, you're out of the family." That was it. No signature, but I didn't need one. It was my father's message, thinly veiled. A last-ditch attempt at control, but it didn't hurt me the way he'd hoped. Because by then I had already realized I'd never truly been in the family, not as a daughter, not as someone who mattered. The next week was a storm. Scott, my eldest brother, confronted me first. He stormed into the kitchen while I was making breakfast and slammed his hand on the counter. "What the hell, Olivia? You're really going to make us pay to live here?" "I'm not making anyone do anything," I replied. "You can sign the lease or you can move out. It's your choice." He stared at me like I had spoken a foreign language. "You're insane." "No," I said quietly. "I'm just done being your safety net." He stormed out, muttering curses under his breath. The next day, my other brother, Aaron, decided to try charm instead of confrontation. He sat beside me in the living room and gave a performance worthy of an Oscar. "Come on, Liv," he said, using the nickname he hadn't used in years. "We're family. This doesn't have to get messy." "It's already messy," I replied. "You've both been living here for years without contributing a dime. You've disrespected me, dismissed me, and now that the tables have turned, you want to talk like adults?" He sighed and gave me that look I knew too well, the one that tried to guilt me back into silence. "Dad's not handling this well. You're really hurting him." I leaned back. He told me I was a burden. Remember that, at his party, in front of everyone. Aaron didn't reply. Because what could he say? Later that week, the letters officially arrived from my attorney confirming the rent deadlines and offering mediation sessions. Unsurprisingly, no one showed. Instead, my father tried a new tactic: shame. One morning, I came downstairs to find a group of our extended family sitting in the living room. Aunts, uncles, cousins, all of them looking at me with various shades of pity and judgment. My father stood in front of them like a preacher before a congregation. "She's trying to take the house from under us," he declared, "after everything we've done for her." My mother sat nearby, eyes down, not saying a word. My brothers flanked him like guards. I walked in calmly, stood beside the fireplace, and waited for him to finish. When he finally paused, I spoke. "Everything you've done for me," I said. "Let's talk about that. You mean raising me while reminding me daily that I was a burden. You mean letting me pay for renovations and not once acknowledging it. You mean ignoring me at every family gathering, but expecting me to play hostess and clean up afterward." No one spoke. "I own this house," I continued, "legally, factually. This isn't about greed, it's about respect. And I haven't had any from this family in over a decade. A few of the cousins shifted uncomfortably. My aunt whispered something to her husband. I saw cracks forming in their judgmental stares. Not everyone knew the full story. They'd only heard my father's side. "This house is not your legacy," I said, locking eyes with him. "It's mine. Grandpa left it to me because he saw what you refused to see." And with that, I left the room. I could feel the air behind me shift. The silence didn't follow me up the stairs. It stayed down there, choking them. That night, my phone buzzed with messages from relatives. A few apologies, a few excuses. Some said they had no idea. One even offered to help me pack if I needed to leave. I replied with a photo of the deed. By the end of the month, the deadline for signing the lease arrived. No one signed, so I did the next logical thing. I posted a listing for the house online. The title was simple: Family Home for Sale, priced to move quickly. Within days, offers poured in. The market was hot and the house was in a prime location. I scheduled showings, brought in a real estate agent, and let the process begin. When my father found out, he exploded. "You're tearing this family apart," he screamed. "No," I said. "You did that a long time ago. I'm just refusing to carry the pieces anymore." The morning after I walked out of my parents' house, something shifted in me. It wasn't just disappointment anymore, it was resolve. I returned to the city, moved back into the small apartment I shared with an old college friend, and poured myself into my career. I wasn't going to let my father's words define me. "Just a burden," he had said. But the burden was gone now, from their home and from my own spirit. I was going to build a life that no one could question, no matter how much it hurt that it would be built in the absence of family. For years, I'd worked in real estate, quietly, steadily buying small properties, fixing them up and renting them out. It wasn't flashy, but it was solid. And then came the deal that changed everything. A downtown building that was undervalued because the sellers were desperate. I bought it with the last of my savings and a small private loan. I renovated the property, leased out the storefronts, and within 18 months, the building's value had quadrupled. That one deal opened doors. Investors noticed, banks called back, and my portfolio began to grow. I became a silent player in the city's property market, still discreet, still under the radar, but far from a burden. I hadn't spoken to my family in over a year. Occasionally, my mother would text something passive, aggressive, or send a photo from a family gathering I wasn't invited to. Birthdays, holidays, weddings, I was never included. It stung less over time. I stopped waiting for a change that wasn't coming. That is, until one morning, I got a voicemail from my cousin Jenna. "Hey Rachel, sorry to bother you, but, weird question, do you still have paperwork on the old family house, like from Grandma's will or anything? Call me when you can. The house, Grandma's house. The one my father had moved into when she passed away. The same one he always referred to as ours." But Jenna's question triggered something. I hadn't thought about that property in years, but the memory came back in full color. Sitting beside Grandma as she filled out the deed transfer before her surgery, insisting I hold on to it. "Just in case your father gets foolish," she'd said, chuckling. At the time, I didn't understand why she wanted it in my name, but now everything was starting to make sense. I dug through my files, heart pounding, and there it was. The original deed, notarized and legally binding, transferring the house to me. Not to my dad, not to my mom, to me. My fingers trembled as I flipped through the supporting documents. Utility bills addressed to Grandma, her signature on the property release form, and a quiet hand. Written note tucked between the pages. "Rachel, you've always had the heart to care for what matters. This is yours now. Love, Grandma." A rush of emotion flooded over me. Shock, grief, and an unexpected pang of vindication. All these years, they'd lived there as though it belonged to them. My father had called me a burden while reciting rent, free in a house I legally owned. I took a deep breath, leaned back in my chair, and smiled for the first time in days. The burden was about to shift, but I wasn't out for revenge. I wanted respect. So I called my lawyer first to make sure everything was enforceable. She confirmed it was airtight. Grandma had done everything by the book. The house was legally mine, and no amount of family gossip could undo it. I started with a polite letter, not an eviction notice yet, just a formal document stating that I had reviewed my property records and confirmed ownership of the house at 118 Brookview Lane. I requested a meeting to discuss terms for continued occupancy. I signed it with kindness. Sincerely, Rachel Green. 3 days later, my mother called. Not to apologize, not to explain, but to accuse. What kind of sick joke is this? She snapped. Your father is furious. You know how much that house means to him. What are you trying to prove? I stayed calm. I'm not trying to prove anything, just exercising my rights. We can talk about a rental agreement or a buy-out, whichever works for you. Silence. Then she scoffed. You've really changed. No. I said softly. I've just remembered who I am. Word spread fast in the family. My inbox filled with messages from aunts, uncles, and cousins, some siding with me quietly, others not. So, quietly calling me selfish, but a few said what mattered most. She always belittled you, Rachel. Good for you for standing tall. And my cousin Jenna. She invited me for dinner the following week, smiling warmly as she said, Grandma would have been proud. I gave my parents 30 days to respond. They sent back a counteroffer, one that undervalued the home by nearly half. I declined it. I wasn't being greedy. I was asking for market value. When negotiations broke down, my attorney filed the formal notice to vacate. My father's silence spoke louder than any threat. But on the 29th day, something unexpected happened. I got a letter, not from my parents, but from the mayor's office. Apparently, they had received word about my development work downtown and wanted to speak with me about a local revitalization project. They needed someone with experience, with vision, and with a personal tie to the community. I met with them, outlined my ideas, and within a month, I was leading a city-backed initiative to restore 5 historic properties, including the house my parents lived in. And that was when the tide turned entirely. Suddenly, I wasn't just a burden. I was the face of a movement, a project that brought jobs, preserved heritage, and gave me the platform I never knew I'd wanted. I stood in front of city council with blueprints, passion, and a story of quiet perseverance. My name was on every document. My story was on every newsletter. My legacy was being built, trite where my family had tried to erase me. By the time the eviction deadline arrived, I had a choice to make: enforce the order or offer a new agreement on my terms. I chose the latter not because they deserved it, but because I did. I leased the house back to them under a legal contract with a respectful rent. I wasn't punishing them. I was making sure they understood. I had value, I had power, and I had every right to take up space. As I walked away from the courthouse that day, my lawyer patted me on the back and said, "You handled that with class." And for the first time in years, I truly believed it. Because in the end, it wasn't about the house. It was about finally owning my story. The morning after the lease was signed, I stood in front of the mirror, straightening the collar of my blazer. There was something surreal about the day ahead. A city planning board meeting, a scheduled TV interview, and then in the evening, an award dinner hosted by the local Chamber of Commerce. My name, once ignored at family tables and overlooked at school reunions, now echoed in circles of power. I didn't seek attention, I sought respect, and slowly it was coming, not from my family, but from the world they used to say I'd never succeed in. The city's downtown revitalization project was making headlines. Investors were buzzing. Local newspapers called it the most ambitious heritage restoration initiative in decades. I was no longer just Rachel who rents out buildings. I was a developer, a visionary, words that had never been used for someone like me in the eyes of my father. But now, my name was etched on plaques, printed on brochures, and listed in the guest speakers program. And tonight, I would stand on a stage at the gala, where all the city's biggest names would be present, including, unbeknownst to me, someone from my own family. I arrived early at the venue, a historic hall restored as part of the city project. As the valet took my keys, I glanced at the building. Its polished brick walls, newly restored, stained. glass windows, and golden lighting that bathed the entrance in warm prestige. I remembered walking past this very building years ago, broke and defeated, never dreaming I'd one day lead its restoration. Life had come full circle, but I wasn't prepared for how sharply it would twist tonight. The gala was elegant, filled with city officials, business leaders, and philanthropists. Waiters moved gracefully with trays of champagne, and jazz music floated in the background. I made my way through the crowd, exchanging nods and warm greetings, until a voice behind me stopped me cold. "Rachel, it was my sister." I turned slowly. She stood there in a long blue gown, holding a flute of champagne. Beside her was my father. His face tightened as our eyes met. "What are you doing here?" I asked, my voice steady. "We were invited," my sister said. "Dad donated to the Historical Preservation Fund. Didn't know you were the keynote." Of course. My father always knew how to make an entrance, to insert himself into circles he once scorned. I wanted to ask why he was suddenly supporting projects he had no interest in before. But instead, I smiled politely. "I hope you enjoy the event," I said. He didn't respond, just stared at me with an unreadable expression. Minutes later, I was ushered to the stage. The host took the mic and introduced me as the visionary behind the revitalization project, applauding my determination and work ethic. The crowd clapped, some standing. I stepped into the spotlight, heart pounding, not from fear, but from the weight of everything it had taken to get here. As I spoke about the power of legacy, about reclaiming forgotten spaces and investing in community, I saw their faces in the crowd, my father's stone, cold stare, my sister's furrowed brows. I didn't mention family. I didn't need to. My presence was proof enough. I ended with the line I had written weeks ago, never expecting the irony it would now carry. Sometimes the places we rebuild are the ones that were never meant to be torn down, not just in architecture, but in people. The applause was thunderous. After I stepped down, I was swarmed by guests, shaking hands, exchanging cards, and even posing for photos. But in the corner of the room, my father remained seated, motionless. Eventually, he stood and left without a word. My sister trailed behind him, and I stood there, surrounded by praise and flashing cameras, feeling something unfamiliar, not pride, not vindication, something deeper, wholeness. The next day, things escalated. A news feature ran a story titled "The Woman Behind the City's Comeback." My photo was front and center, my email flooded with opportunities, invitations, and a single message that stood out. "We need to talk," it read. It was from my father. I hesitated before replying, but curiosity won. We met at a quiet cafe near the edge of the city, away from eyes and expectations. He was already seated when I arrived, nursing a black coffee. "You've done well," he said, not meeting my gaze. "Thank you," I replied. Silence stretched between us before he finally looked up. "Why didn't you tell me you own the house, that Grandma left it to you?" I met his eyes. "Would it have changed anything if I did?" He didn't answer. I continued. "You called me a burden. You pushed me out, and all the while you were living in my home." "I didn't know," he muttered. "I thought. You thought it would always be yours," I said. "Just like everything else." He leaned back. "I may have been harsh, but you don't understand the pressure I was under. You didn't see how hard it was. Keeping the family together, managing finances. Don't rewrite history." I said calmly. "You didn't keep us together. You fractured us. You made me believe I wasn't worth space in your world." His jaw clenched. "And now I make space for myself," I said, "and for people who believe in me." He looked away, blinking hard. Then, after a long pause, he whispered, "Your grandmother would have been proud." It was the first time in years I heard softness in his voice. We didn't reconcile that day. There were no hugs, no tearful apologies. But we left with something closer to understanding, a mutual acknowledgement of pain, of growth, and of things that could not be undone. Weeks later, I received a letter from my father. It wasn't long. Just a few lines. "I read your speech. I kept the newspaper article. You were never a burden. I'm sorry it took me this long to say it." I folded the letter and tucked it into the back of the deed file, where Grandma's note still rested. The house may have been the battleground, but the war was never about bricks and wood. It was about recognition. Now I had both. The weeks following our tense cafe conversation passed in a surreal blur. My development firm was expanding into new neighborhoods. My calendar filled with meetings, ribbon cuttings, and calls from high-level investors who had finally begun to notice me. But in the quiet moments, I found myself returning again and again to my father's letter. The brief, handwritten note where he said I was never a burden. It was so short, so delayed, yet it held the weight of decades of silence. Still, something about the apology didn't feel complete. Not yet. While I had taken the house legally, and had every right to, I never did it to humiliate anyone. I did it because I had to take back control over a life they'd once made feel small. But now, even as my public success soared, my private self still carried the remnants of that wound. Those years where I was ignored at dinner, my ideas dismissed, my worth questioned. Then came the city gala celebrating the leaders of renewal. A high-profile event recognizing individuals who were driving growth and transformation in the community. I had been selected as one of the honorees. When the invitation came, embossed in gold, I hesitated before RSVPing. It wasn't that I felt unworthy. It was that I didn't want my recognition to be reduced to a night of forced smiles and shallow praise. I didn't want the same people who once looked down on me clapping now only because success made them feel obligated. But something inside me said go, not for them, for myself. The night of the gala arrived. I wore a deep emerald gown, sharp and confident. My assistant greeted me at the venue doors, handing me a printout of my speech and giving a thumbs up. I thanked her and walked through the towering marble columns into the grand ballroom. The chandeliers sparkled above like constellations. I had been to enough events now to not be overwhelmed by glitz, but tonight felt different. This was the culmination of everything. As I entered, I noticed guests whispering. Then from the far end of the room I saw him, my father. He was standing near the bar, dressed in a black tuxedo, talking to a city official I vaguely recognized. Our eyes met across the crowd, and for a long moment neither of us moved. I didn't know he would be here. Apparently, he had received a ticket through the Preservation Fund committee he'd recently started donating to. Part of me suspected he had come just for me. Still, I looked away first. When the keynote speeches began, I sat at the front table beside the mayor and 2 state senators. One of them leaned over and whispered, "We're grateful for your leadership, Rachel. Your work's changed this city." I nodded politely, feeling the glow of acknowledgement, but also feeling that weight again. The internal tension that still hadn't found peace. The MC took the stage and read from a small card. And now, to honor one of our brightest leaders, a woman who has not only restored buildings but faith in what can be built again. Please welcome Rachel Whitmore. As I stepped up to the podium, the room rose in a standing ovation. Flashbulbs flickered, my name echoed. But when I looked into the crowd, I didn't search for the dignitaries or donors. I searched for the face that had once looked at me with disappointment, with shame. And there he was, my father, his hands in his lap, not clapping, just watching. I began my speech slowly. Most people believe rebuilding a city starts with money, permits, and bricks. But what it really starts with is belief. Someone believing in you, even when no one else does. I didn't always have that belief from the people closest to me. In fact, I was told I wasn't worth the investment. That I was a burden. Gasps fluttered through the audience. I didn't pause. But sometimes when the people who should believe in you don't, you learn to believe in yourself. And when you do that, brick by brick, you create something stronger than any structure. You build yourself. I didn't look at him, but I felt his gaze grow heavier. I stand here not because I had everything handed to me, but because I learned that value isn't something others give you. It's something you declare for yourself. Applause followed, loud, passionate applause. I wrapped up the rest of my remarks, thanked my team, and exited the stage. Back at my table, the mayor patted my shoulder, saying, "Powerful words, Rachel. The city's lucky to have you." I smiled and thanked him. After dessert was served, I stepped out onto the terrace to breathe. The air was crisp, the skyline glowing like an electric painting. That's when I heard the door behind me creak open. "I thought it might be you out here." my father said, stepping into the moonlight. I didn't turn. I figured you'd left. I almost did, he replied, but I stayed to hear your speech. I nodded, still not turning to face him. You meant me, didn't you, when you said you were called a burden? Finally I turned. Yes, I said, but not to shame you. I said it because it was true. He looked older than I remembered. Maybe it was the lighting, or maybe it was the weight of his own regrets catching up. I deserved that, he said. I did say it. I thought I was doing what was best for the family. Tough love, you know. I crossed my arms. You weren't loving, Dad, just tough. He sighed deeply. You're right. That caught me off guard. He walked toward the railing, looking out at the city below. Do you remember when your mother died? You were 12 and I just shut down. I didn't know how to be both parents, so I threw myself into work, into control. I thought if I kept things tight, strict, no nonsense, we'd stay afloat. You didn't have to treat me like a liability. I didn't know how to treat you at all. I failed you, he said. Then he turned. But I see you now, all of you, and I wish I'd seen you sooner. For the first time in decades, I saw sincerity in his eyes. Why now? I asked. Why say it here, at a gala? Because it took seeing the world admire you to finally listen to what I ignored all those years. He admitted. And maybe I needed to be reminded that you were never the problem. I was. Tears pricked at my eyes, not because of the words, but because I realized I no longer needed them. I had grown without them. Still, hearing them now, as a full woman with her own foundation, it meant something. I'm not asking to erase the past, he continued, but maybe, if you're open to it, we could try again, as adults. I hesitated, then nodded slowly. That depends. Are you willing to accept the daughter I am now, not the one you tried to shape? I wouldn't dare change you now, he said with a tired smile. You're the strongest person I know. And in that quiet exchange, something shifted. Years of pain didn't dissolve, but they softened, just enough for peace to begin threading its way into the cracks. As we walked back inside, side by side, not father leading daughter, not daughter following father, but equals walking under the soft lights of recognition and truth, I realized the true climax wasn't that I had succeeded. It was that I had been seen. After that gala night, something inside me changed, not in the loud, dramatic way I always imagined resolution would feel, but in a quiet, deliberate sort of shift. Like the moment you realize your breath is steady after a long run, or that the storm outside has passed while you weren't watching. My father's apology didn't undo years of pain, nor did it suddenly rewrite history, but it brought something far more important into focus: clarity. The next morning, I stood by my apartment window overlooking the skyline, sipping coffee as the sun painted the buildings gold. For the first time in years, I wasn't dwelling on the past. I wasn't bracing for the next cutting remark or second, guessing my own worth. I simply existed in the present, with peace. It was a powerful, unfamiliar feeling. Still, life didn't pause just because I had reached emotional clarity. Business was booming. We had just secured our largest urban renewal contract yet, transforming a series of condemned blocks into affordable, eco-friendly housing. I was meeting with architects, engineers, city officials, each of them bringing ideas to the table, but all of them deferring to mine. I wasn't just at the table anymore. I was at the head of it, and yet, amidst the whirlwind of meetings and press interviews, a letter came, not an email, not a text, a real physical letter in a cream-colored envelope with my father's precise handwriting on the front. I opened it with cautious fingers. Inside was a deed, one I didn't expect, the deed to the cabin my grandfather had built decades ago. Tucked away in the mountains, it was where I used to go as a child during summers, escaping the tension of home. My mother and I had painted the shutters blue one year, laughing as the paint dripped onto our shoes. After her death, we never went back, until now. The cabin was mine, legally transferred, fully signed, and accompanied by a note that simply read, "You always found peace here. Now let it be yours." Gad, I stared at the paper for a long time. This wasn't just property. It was acknowledgement, not grand or performative, just quiet understanding, and it hit me harder than any speech could. Still, I didn't rush to call him. There were things I needed to do before extending my hand again. Not out of spite, but out of self-preservation. Healing wasn't a straight line, and I needed to walk the rest of mine with intention. That weekend, I drove out to the cabin for the first time in over 20 years. It was exactly how I remembered it, weathered, overgrown, but still standing proud like an old friend waiting for your return. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. Dust motes danced in the shafts of sunlight spilling through the windows. The floorboards creaked beneath my heels, and then, in the silence, I heard her laughter. My mother's, as if the walls themselves had held onto her memory. I didn't cry, I smiled. I spent 2 days cleaning, repainting the shutters once more, this time a deep forest green. I lit a fire in the old hearth, cooked a simple meal, and curled up in the same corner where I used to read as a child. It wasn't a getaway, it was a return to myself. The next morning I made a decision. I called my father. He picked up after the second ring. "Rachel," he said, as if tasting the name slowly, "I didn't think you'd call." I went to the cabin. I said, "Thank you." A pause. She would have loved to see it again. "Your mother?" "I know," I replied. I felt her there. We talked for 20 minutes. Not about the past, not about what had been said or done, but about the things that lay ahead. He told me he was thinking of retiring early, starting a mentorship program for young entrepreneurs. I told him I'd just broken ground on the new education complex in South Haven. It was civil, calm, almost warm. Before hanging up, he said, "I'm proud of you." And for the first time, I believed he meant it. Weeks passed. The family naturally found out about everything. My sister, who had once mocked my ambition, called and offered to meet for coffee. She said she wanted to apologize for siding with Dad all those years. I agreed to meet, not because I needed her apology, but because I was learning the power of grace. She cried in the cafe, telling me she'd envied my strength, that she was ashamed for calling me selfish when I bought the house. I forgave her. It didn't erase anything, but it was a beginning. Then came the fundraiser for the city's youth arts program. I had been asked to host it at the historic house. Yes, the very one I'd reclaimed from my father. I hesitated at first, not wanting to flaunt my success, but eventually agreed. It was never about revenge, it was about impact. And this, I realized, was my chance to give that house a new legacy. We transformed the rooms into gallery spaces, featuring young artists from underserved neighborhoods. The foyer was filled with sculptures, the dining room displayed powerful portraits, the backyard hosted poetry readings beneath string lights and stars. It was vibrant, alive, and full of joy. Toward the end of the evening, I found myself standing alone in the room that once served as my parents' study. I had turned it into a space for spoken word performances, its walls lined with books I donated from my own collection. As a young girl, I wasn't allowed in this room without permission. Tonight, I owned it. My father arrived late, walking in with a quiet nod. He didn't make a scene, didn't try to steal attention. He just stood at the edge of the crowd, watching the young performers with something like awe in his eyes. Later, as guests began to leave, he approached me. "You've turned it into something beautiful," he said. "I never imagined." "I did," I said gently. "I always did." He nodded slowly, then handed me a small, wrapped package. Inside was an old family photo I hadn't seen in years, one of me as a child holding up a drawing I had made. On the back, he had written in ink, "This is when I should have known." I said nothing. I simply hugged him, not long, not dramatically, just enough. That night, as I locked the front door behind the last guest, I stood in the silence of the house and felt whole, not victorious, not vindicated, just whole. I had taken back what was mine, not just the house or my voice or my future, but my place in the world. I was no longer the burden. I was the builder, and what I had built was finally enough for me. A few weeks after the fundraiser, life seemed to find its own rhythm again, not in the way it was before, tense, uncertain, strained, but in a new, steadier pulse, one that moved with grace instead of grit. I no longer woke up with that familiar tightness in my chest, wondering if today would be another battle to prove myself. That need, the aching hunger for validation from people who once dismissed me, had started to fade, and what replaced it wasn't loud or showy. It was quiet confidence, peaceful power, but resolution doesn't always mean retreat. It doesn't mean vanishing into a comfortable success. Sometimes, resolution means stepping forward again, but with clearer vision and stronger footing. One morning, I received an invitation in the mail, one that startled me at first. It was from the alumni board of my father. University, the same one where he had once been celebrated, where I had sat in the shadows of his reputation for years. They were hosting a leadership summit and had invited me to be a featured speaker. At first, I thought it was a mistake. Surely, they were looking for someone else with my name. But no, it was real. There, printed in bold, Rachel Whitmore, founder and CEO, keynote speaker. I sat at the kitchen table, rereading the letter in stunned silence. The same institution that once ignored me was now asking me to lead. That irony wasn't lost on me. I didn't accept immediately. I needed to think, not about whether I was capable, but whether I was ready to revisit that space, one so deeply entwined with my father's legacy. Later that week, I met with him for lunch at a quiet rooftop cafe downtown. It had become a new ritual of sorts. Once a month, we'd meet without fanfare. Without pretense, just two people trying to rebuild something broken, one shared moment at a time. I got invited to speak at the university. I said, sipping my coffee, watching his reaction closely. He looked up, his expression unreadable for a moment. The summit? He asked, I heard about that. That's a big deal. I know. I said, but I'm not sure if I want to do it. Why not? I hesitated, choosing my words carefully, because that place, it always felt like it belonged to you. I never had a place there. Even when I visited campus as a kid, everyone treated me like Dr. Whitmore's daughter, not Rachel, not me. He nodded slowly, stirring the ice in his glass. I didn't realize it felt that way. I guess I was too busy being proud to see how that shadow fell on you. There it was again. Not defensiveness, not denial, but accountability. You should do it, he said after a pause, not for them. Not even for me, but for yourself. That stage was always yours too, you just didn't know it. I exhaled, maybe you're right. He leaned back, giving me a half smile. For what it's worth, if I were still on the board, I'd have voted to bring you in years ago. I chuckled. If you were still on the board, I probably wouldn't have said yes. That made him laugh too. For the first time in what felt like forever, we weren't adversaries. We weren't fragments of old arguments. We were two people who'd finally stopped shouting long enough to listen. A week later, I accepted the speaking invitation. The day of the summit, I walked onto campus with a sense of purpose I'd never felt before. Gone was the girl who once sat quietly in lecture halls, while professors referenced her father's work as gospel. Gone was the daughter who once worried if she'd ever be seen as more than a burden. In her place stood a woman who had not only built an empire but rebuilt herself from the ashes of other people's opinions. The auditorium was packed, students, faculty, alumni, all waiting. I stepped up to the podium, adjusted the mic, and smiled. When I was a kid, I was often told that success meant following a path laid out for you, especially if your family had already walked it. But what they don't tell you is that sometimes the path you inherit isn't meant for your feet. I paused, scanning the crowd, and when you dare to step off that path, when you choose to build your own, you're often met with resistance. Doubt, even rejection. Especially from those closest to you. A murmur of understanding passed through the audience. But if I've learned anything, I continued, it's this. What people call rebellion is often just the first step toward becoming who you're meant to be. I didn't mention my father by name. I didn't have to. The people who knew, and the rest, they simply listened. Afterward, I was approached by dozens of students, young women mostly, thanking me for showing them a different kind of strength. One of them, a first-generation student, said, I didn't think someone like me could do what you do. I placed a hand on her shoulder. You absolutely can, but don't do it the way I did. Do it your way. That's how we change things. Later that evening, my father called. I watched the live stream. He said, you were breathtaking, thank you. I replied, warmth blooming in my chest. I hope one day when they talk about Whitmore at the university, they mean you. I smiled. Maybe they will. In the months that followed, I continued my work, but with renewed focus. I launched a mentorship program for young women in underserved communities, offering not just financial support, but guidance, internships, and a seat at the table. My first mentee, a brilliant 19-year-old named Tasha, reminded me so much of myself. Sharp, thoughtful, underestimated. She once told me, you don't just open doors, you build new rooms. That stayed with me. Meanwhile, my relationship with my father, still a work in progress, continued to evolve. We no longer pretended the past hadn't happened. Instead, we acknowledged it, learned from it, and let it shape a more honest present. There were still moments of tension, but they were tempered by mutual respect. For the first time in our lives, we were speaking the same language, not one of obligation or expectation, but truth. One spring afternoon, we visited the cabin together. He helped me replant the garden out front. As we worked side by side, dirt under our fingernails, he said quietly, "You know, I used to think success was about control. Now I think it's about impact, and you've had more impact than I ever did." I looked at him, surprised. "You were a respected professor. A leader in your field," he nodded. "And you've changed lives, Rachel. That's legacy. Not a name on a building, but a name people remember because it changed their direction." I didn't know what to say, so I just planted another seed, literally and metaphorically. That evening, we sat on the porch as the sun set. No words were necessary. I had sold the house that once felt like a prison, but in return, I had gained so much more: a reclaimed identity, a chosen family, and a future no longer dictated by someone else's idea of who I should be. I was never the burden. I was always the foundation, and now I was the architect of my own story. When I look back at everything, arguments, the cold silences, the years of being told I was just a burden, I don't feel anger anymore. I don't feel the need to fight for space at a table that was never built with me in mind. What I feel now is something simpler, but far more powerful: understanding. Not just understanding of who they were or what they believed, but of who I am and how far I've come from the person I was when I first heard those words from my father's mouth. Just a burden. For a long time, I let those words define me. I let them sit on my shoulders like a weight I thought I had to carry to prove him wrong. But here's what I've learned. Proving someone wrong should never come at the cost of proving yourself right. There's a strange kind of fuel in pain, in rejection, in being underestimated. It drives you to rise, to fight, to conquer. But it can also blind you to the softer victories, the ones that come from healing, from letting go, from rebuilding not just your world, but your sense of worth. I didn't succeed in spite of my father's words. I succeeded because I finally stopped trying to outrun them. Sometimes we grow up in households where love is conditional, where value is measured by compliance, and worth is awarded only to those who fall in line. I lived in that house, and then eventually I sold it. But even before the paperwork was signed, I had already left that space emotionally. I had already begun building something new. When I took ownership of the house, not just legally but emotionally, I thought it was about revenge, about reclaiming what they said I didn't deserve. But now I know it wasn't about taking something from them. It was about returning to myself. It was about creating a space where my voice mattered, where I could rewrite the narrative of my life without asking for permission. And that's the lesson I hope others take from this story. You don't need anyone's permission to matter. You don't need validation to be valuable. The people who try to reduce you, silence you, or make you feel small are often projecting their own fears. It's not your job to fix them. It's your job to rise anyway. Healing doesn't always look like reconciliation. It doesn't always mean the people who hurt you will say they're sorry. But healing can look like peace, like choosing joy in spite of history. It can mean planting new roots in soil you once feared. It can mean painting the shutters of a cabin you now call your own. It took me years to realize that my worth was never meant to be measured by my family's expectations, that I could be both soft and strong, both ambitious and gentle, both hurt and healing. I was allowed to be more than their labels. I was allowed to be whole. And as for my father, he changed, yes, but that change didn't come because I begged for it. It came because I stopped needing it. The moment I stopped chasing his approval was the moment I gained my freedom. And in that freedom, he was forced to meet me as equal, not as a daughter desperate for praise, but as a woman standing firmly in her own truth. Today, when I walk into the house I once reclaimed, I don't see shadows anymore. I see stories of survival, of transformation, of self-respect. I see the faces of the young women who come through my mentorship program. I see the students from underserved neighborhoods showcasing their art in rooms once closed off to people like them. I see light and laughter and legacy, not the kind of legacy that comes with a title or inheritance, the kind of legacy that lives on in the lives we touch. Kind of legacy that says, you are enough. The kind that tells the next generation, you don't have to wait for a seat at the table. You can build your own. I share this story not because I want sympathy or applause or even closure. I share it because someone out there is still being told they're a burden. Someone is still shrinking to fit inside a family that doesn't recognize their worth. And to that person, I say, you are not alone, and you are not a burden. You are becoming. You are building something that others may not yet understand. You are walking a path that may not have footsteps before yours, and that's okay, because one day someone will look at what you've built, not with judgment but with awe, and realize they were wrong to ever doubt you. They'll say your name with respect. They'll tell your story as proof that healing is possible, and they'll learn, as I did, that the real power doesn't come from proving others wrong. It comes from proving to yourself that you were always right to believe in more.